For 3 years he ruled without her. The night she returned, his wolf remembered everything. I made the wrong choice on a Tuesday. I know this now with the certainty of a man who has had 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days to turn it over in his hands. I was standing in the eastern corridor of Ethanmore's great hall when I told Saren that the bond we both felt was likely a trick of proximity, that healers and pack lords sometimes confused deep familiarity with the fated pull, that she deserved a life unburdened by the demands of a crown she had not asked for, and that I thought it best if she continued her circuit through the borderlands as her mother had, free and unhurried and belonging to no one's territory. She had looked at me for a moment, not with anger, which I might have survived, not with tears, which I think I was braced for. She had looked at me with the expression of someone who had just received information they had not quite expected, filing it away carefully, and then she had nodded once, pulled her cloak a little closer, and said, "All right, Calder, take care of yourself." She left the next morning before the gates opened. My wolf did not howl, he did not rage. He simply went quiet, and he stayed that way for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, a silence in my chest so complete and so even that I sometimes forgot he was there at all. I ruled. I mediated territory disputes and treaty feasts and grain shortages, and the particular misery of trying to convince the northern border packs that Ethanmore was not encroaching on their hunting grounds. I was, by every account that reached me, a competent and respected Alpha King. My council told me so regularly. My wolves held the border without complaint. I did not think about her. I told myself this often enough that it began to feel almost true. The message arrived on the last cold morning of the season, carried by one of Marin's own people, a boy of perhaps 12, wrapped in 3 layers and still shivering, who had ridden 4 days from the borderland cottage, where the elder kept her strange and quiet court of strays and wanderers, and anyone who knocked on her door without a pack to their name. Marin was dying. I had known Marin since I was 7 years old. She had set my wrist when I broke it falling from the old mill wall, had fed my father's wolves through 2 hard winters, and had once told me, in the forthright way she had, that I was going to be a good king if I learned to stop thinking so loudly. She was 91 years old and had outlasted 4 alphas before me, and now she was dying and she had asked for Saren. Not for me, for Saren. I stood in the great hall with the boy's message in my hand, and my steward Bryn watching me with the careful neutrality she adopted when she suspected I was about to do something she would have to diplomatically correct later. And I said, "Send word to wherever she is. Tell her Marin is asking." "She's already been sent for," Bryn said. "Marin's people went to her directly. She'll come through Ethanmore to reach the cottage. It's the fastest route. She'll need lodging." A pause. "For how long?" "As long as Marin needs her. A week, perhaps more." I set the message down on the table with considerably more care than it required. "Prepare the guest chambers in the east wing. See that she has whatever she needs." "Of course," Bryn said, in the tone that meant she was not going to say anything else, which was worse than anything she might have said. My wolf, in the deep quiet of my chest, did not stir. I told myself this was good. She arrived on a Thursday evening at dusk, when the river mist was coming up off the Ethan and the torches in the gate passage had just been lit. I was not watching from the corridor. I was in the corridor because I had a meeting with my Eastern Garrison commander in the adjoining room, and the corridor was a direct route, and the fact that I happened to pause at the narrow window that looked down onto the gate was simply a matter of reasonable timing. She was riding a gray mare I didn't recognize, her own, probably, acquired somewhere in the last 3 years. Her travel cloak was dark and travel-worn, and she had her healer's satchel strapped across her back, the strap worn to softness with use. She swung down from the mare before one of my stable hands could reach her, thanked him by name. She had always done this, learned names immediately, I had never understood how, and began unbuckling the satchel with the brisk efficiency of someone who has arrived in many strange places and knows how to settle into one quickly. She did not look up at the windows. She said something to my head groom, Petra, who laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And then Saren was handing over the mare's reins and walking toward the hall entrance, and I was suddenly aware that I had been standing at that window for considerably longer than a reasonable route to the Eastern Garrison room required. My wolf, for the first time in 3 years, 4 months and 11 days, moved. Not a surge, not a sound. Something quieter than that, a slow turning like a wolf that had been lying with its nose on its paws, lifting its head a fraction, ears shifting forward. A listening. I went to my meeting. She did not come to supper that first evening. Bryn reported with careful professionalism that Saren had eaten in her chambers, asked for hot water and clean bandaging cloth, and departed for Marin's cottage at the borderland by early morning, intending to return by nightfall to sleep and prepare supplies. She was treating the journey as work. She had not asked about my schedule, my movements, or whether I would be present at any particular meal. This was, I told myself, exactly as it should be. She was here for Marin. I was the alpha king of Ethanmore, and she was passing through on her way to a dying elder, and there was nothing between us except 3 years of my own making and a bond I had declared a trick of proximity. On the second evening, she came to the great hall for supper. I did not see her come in. I was at the head of the long table, in conversation with my southern border captain about a disputed waterway, and I became aware of her presence not through sight, but through the attention of my wolves. The 3 that lived freely in the hall, old Brennan's descendants, big gray animals who tolerated guests with regal indifference, all turned their heads toward the doorway at the same moment, a synchronized shift that my southern captain noticed before I did. I looked up. She was standing just inside the doorway, reading the room the way healers do, quickly and without appearing to, cataloging who was present and where the exits were, and whether the energy in the space was safe. She had changed from her travel clothes into a deep blue dress, simple, her dark hair pinned back with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything. She looked, this is not a word I use easily, like herself. Exactly, precisely, and completely herself, as if no time had passed at all, and also as if 3 years had shaped her into something even more settled in her own bones. The 3 wolves padded across the hall and arranged themselves around her feet. She looked down at them with an expression of surprised tenderness, bent to scratch behind the ears of the youngest, and said something to him quietly that I could not hear. My wolf rose another fraction in my chest, still quiet, just awake. I returned my attention to the waterway dispute, which suddenly seemed very small. She did not meet my eyes at supper. This was not avoidance exactly. She was not looking away when I looked at her, performing deliberate non-acknowledgement. It was more that she was genuinely occupied. The young wolf pup who had attached himself to her left knee required periodic attention. 2 of my junior hall staff had apparently discovered she was a healer, and were asking her careful questions about a recurring joint pain in one and a persistent cough in the other. And she was answering both while eating with the competent multitasking of someone who has been useful in crowded rooms for a very long time. She was comfortable here. This was the thing that moved through me like something I didn't have a name for. She was in my hall, in the hall she had never actually lived in the kingdom she had passed through as a traveler, and she was comfortable, not performing comfort, not managing discomfort. She belonged here in the way that some people belong to a place the first moment they step into it, and the hall knew it, and my wolves knew it, and the only person in Ethanmore who had decided she did not fit was standing at the head of the table watching her scratch a wolf pup's ear, and feeling 3 years of his own reasoning begin to develop small and inconvenient cracks. After supper, she looked at me once. It was brief, a glance level and unreadable, the kind of look that a person gives a landscape they have walked through before, measuring whether anything has changed. Then she excused herself to the 2 staff members, thanked Bryn for the meal, and left the hall with the pup following her to the doorway before Brennan's eldest called him back. I sat at the head of the table for some time after the hall had mostly emptied. My wolf was fully awake now, not restless, not urgent, just watching, waiting. I had spent 3 years telling him there was nothing to wait for. On the 4th day, Aldrich arrived. I had known he was coming. The treaty feast had been scheduled 3 months prior. Aldrich was the young alpha of Grenvane, a mid-territory pack 2 days' ride east, newly elevated after his father's death and eager to establish himself as a reasonable and collaborative neighbor. He was perhaps 28, broad-shouldered and easy in his manner, and he had arrived with a retinue of 6 and a gift of smoked riverfish and very good intentions. He noticed Saren within the first hour. This was not remarkable. People noticed Saren. She had a quality of stillness that drew attention in the way that still water draws the eye in a moving landscape, not loudly, but inevitably. What I noticed was the particular quality of Aldrich's attention, which was warm and admiring and entirely appropriate for a man meeting a remarkable woman at a treaty feast, and which I found, without any warning and against all my intentions, deeply intolerable. He sat near her at the pre-feast gathering. She was civil, pleasant, even Saren was always civil. She asked him about Grenvin's winter stores with the genuine interest she brought to everything, and he answered with the slightly expanded detail of a man who was pleased to be asked. And I watched this from across the room while conducting a conversation with two of my council members about grain roots, and understood very little of what was said to me. My wolf was no longer waiting. He had risen fully upright in my chest, silent and absolutely certain, and every instinct I possessed, instincts I had spent 3 years telling myself I had misread, was pointing at Saren across the room with the clarity of something that has never, not for a single hour, actually been in doubt. I had made the wrong choice. I had known it in the quiet underneath every administrative decision and border dispute and treaty feast of the last 3 years, with a certainty I had refused to look at directly. I knew it now. Looking at Aldrich lean slightly toward her to make himself heard over the noise of the hall, I knew it with a finality that felt less like revelation and more like a door that had been shut for 3 years swinging open in a single, inevitable motion. I set my goblet down and crossed the room. I was not quick. I did not need to be. She was not in danger. Aldrich was a man of good intentions, and I had no quarrel with him. I was simply moving toward her in the way that a wolf moves toward what is his, not with aggression, but with the calm, absolute certainty of direction that admits no alternative. I was 3 steps away when Aldrich reached for her hand. Not a grab, a courteous gesture, the kind a host offers to guide a guest toward a seat, easy and social. Saren had started to extend her hand in the automatic politeness of someone accustomed to navigating unfamiliar social landscapes. The bond mark blazed. I felt it on my own wrist first, a sudden and undeniable heat deep in the bone, the kind of warmth that comes not from outside but from within, as if something that had been banked to its lowest ember for 3 years had been given air all at once and remembered what it was. My left wrist. I looked down without meaning to. The mark was visible, not a wound, nothing painful, but a luminous pattern of branching lines, silver gold, the color of moonlight on river water, running from my wrist to the heel of my palm. I had seen mate marks before. I had seen them blaze at territory ceremonies, had watched elders confirm bonds that both parties already knew. I had never seen one appear after 3 years of suppression. I had never understood, until this moment, what 3 years of suppression felt like when it ended. Across the room, Saren had gone very still. She was looking at her own left wrist. The same mark, the same branching lines, the same silver-gold light, visible to every person in the room because the hall had gone quiet with the specific quality of quiet that falls over a room when something destined is happening, and everyone present understands they are watching it. Aldrich had stepped back. He was a reasonable man, and he understood what a blazing bond mark meant, and his expression was the expression of someone who had nearly walked into a situation considerably larger than a treaty dinner. Saren looked at her wrist for a long moment, then she looked at me. I stepped beside her. I did not reach for her hand. I covered it gently, the mark against my palm, the warmth of the bond moving between us like something that had always known exactly where to go. And I turned to the room, to Aldrich, to my council, to my assembled lords and Bryn, standing near the far wall with an expression that was pure and complicated relief. And I said, without performance, without ceremony, in the voice I used when something was simply true, "She is my fated mate. She was always my fated mate." The hall was very quiet. Aldrich nodded once with the grace of a man who had walked into something larger than himself and knew it. My wolves, every one of them in the hall, had gone to their bellies, not in submission, but in the old posture of recognition, the lowering that meant they acknowledged what the bond had named. Saren had not moved her hand. The lords began to drift into quiet conversation, the way people do when they understand a moment has passed, and ordinary life is reasserting itself around it. Bryn began efficiently redirecting the feast preparations. Aldrich found my senior council member and began what would presumably become a treaty conversation conducted with remarkable self-possession for a man who had just had an alpha king step in front of him at a dinner party. Saren and I stood in the small circle of space that the room had unconsciously given us. She was looking at the mark on her wrist. The light had softened from the blazing flare at the moment of recognition to something quieter, steady and warm, like a lamp rather than a torch. She turned her wrist slightly, examining it, and her expression was not the expression I had imagined in any of the versions of this moment I had not allowed myself to imagine. It was not relief. It was not joy, not yet. It was the face of someone sitting down with something they had already known and deciding what they were going to do with it. She looked up at me. "You knew," she said. 3 years ago, you knew what it was." This was not a question, and she did not want me to answer it as one. I understood this. She was not asking whether I had felt the bond. She had felt it too, and we both knew I had. She was asking something else, the thing underneath, the thing I owed her. "Yes," I said, "I knew." "And you told me it was proximity, a mistake." "Yes." She looked at me steadily. "Why?" And this was the question that broke me open, not because it was angry. It wasn't. Her voice was level, the voice of someone who genuinely wants to understand a thing so they can properly account for it. But because it was honest, and it required honesty back, and I had not been honest about this in 3 years, not even with myself. "Because I was afraid," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth. I was not a man who said such things easily, and I was aware of the irony of saying them now in the middle of a feast hall with bond lights still visible on my wrist. But she had asked, and she deserved the real answer, not the king's answer. "You came from no pack, no territory, no bloodline the council would recognize, no history with Ethanmore. You moved like someone who belonged to the whole world and no particular piece of it, and I had spent my entire life learning to belong to this one piece, to this hall, these wolves, this cold river valley. I told myself a king and a wanderer made no sense, that you deserved someone who could travel with you, that I was doing you a kindness." I paused. I was not doing you a kindness. I was protecting myself from wanting something I didn't know how to ask for. Saren was quiet for a moment. The feast noise continued around us, the careful, civilized bustle of a room giving 2 people space, and she looked at the bond mark on her wrist and then at me. "Maren told me," she said finally. 2 years ago, she told me she thought you'd panicked. She said she'd seen you panic once before, when your father died, and you had to take the crown at 17, and that you looked the same way both times, like a man deciding the danger was easier to face alone. I absorbed this. She was right. I know she was. A pause. She's irritatingly right about most things. It's exhausting. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile yet, but the precursor to one. The slight relaxing around the eyes that meant she was still herself, still Saren, still the woman who had thanked my stable hand by name and let the wolf pup sleep against her leg at supper, and made my hall feel inhabited in a way it had not felt in 3 years. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," I said. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight except to not leave again before I've had the chance to do this honestly, to say what it was, to not pretend it was anything other than what it was." She considered this for a long moment. Then she looked at the bond mark again, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone making a decision they have already half made, confirming it. "I came for Maren," she said. "I'm going to stay until she doesn't need me anymore. That's the only promise I'm making right now." "That's enough," I said, and meant it. Maren lasted another 12 days. I did not spend those 12 days pressing my case, declaring my intentions before the council, or making any of the formal moves that a king is expected to make when a bond mark has blazed before his assembled lords and the whole of the Eastern Treaty delegation. Bryn managed the delicate business of what had been witnessed and what it meant with the skilled diplomacy that made her indispensable, and Aldrich departed for Grenvane with his treaty terms and his dignity, and, I was told, a remarkably good attitude about the entire thing, which I respected. I spent those 12 days being useful. This sounds small. It was not small. Saren was traveling daily to Maren's cottage, 4 hours ride and 4 hours back, sometimes more, depending on how the elder was and what she needed. And she was doing it alone, with her gray mare and her healer's satchel and the focused efficiency of someone who has always worked without support. I began, carefully, to make the support available without requiring her to accept it. Fresh provisions appeared at the stable each morning, not from me explicitly, but from the hall kitchen, portioned for a day's travel. The road to the borderland was surveyed and its worst ruts were addressed. The cottage was stocked with what I knew Maren liked. On the third day, Saren appeared at the stable and found me already there, saddling my own horse. She looked at the horse, then at me. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "The Eastern Border Survey is overdue. It takes me past the cottage road." A pause. "Does it?" "The long way." Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that I felt my wolf settle another fraction. The deep bonies of a creature finding its way back to something it had not been able to name the absence of. "All right," she said, "but I ride faster than you." She did ride faster than me. I had forgotten this. She had a way with horses that was similar to her way with wolves, and I was beginning to suspect, with most living things, an ease, an absence of demand, a quality of attention that made them willing. Her gray mare moved with a briskness through the river mist of the borderland road that my heavier Ethan Moore stallion could not quite match, and I watched her ahead of me in the early morning light and thought, I built this absence myself. Every morning I rode alone for 3 years was a morning I built with my own hands and called prudence. We rode together in easy silence for the most part. She told me, in the stretches where the road widened, what Maren had been like in the years between, not for my sake, I understood, but because she needed to say it, needed to give the time a shape out loud. The elder had continued taking in strays and wanderers. She had learned to make a goat milk cheese that Saren said was aggressively mediocre, but that she had accepted 6 rounds of because Maren was proud of it. She had told stories in the evenings, long ones, the kind that wound back on themselves 3 times before resolving, and Saren said she had begun to understand that the winding was not a flaw but the point, that Maren wanted you to stay inside a story long enough to forget you were in one. I listened to all of it. I was aware, riding through the river mist with Saren ahead of me on her gray mare, that this was what I had refused myself. Not the grand moments, not the bond mark blazing, not the naming before the court, but this. The ordinary weight of a day shared, her voice on the morning road. The shape of someone beside you that fits. On the 9th day, she let me stay at the cottage while she worked. I had not expected this. I had been waiting at the gate. The borderland cottages all had gates. Low stone walls, really practical rather than defensive. While she went inside, and I was reviewing in my mind the Eastern Survey notes I had actually brought in the saddlebag, because this was genuinely also a working day for me, and I had not lied about the survey, when the cottage door opened and Saren leaned out. "There's tea," she said, "and Maren wants to see you." Maren was lying in the bed by the window, small and white-haired and entirely herself. She looked at me when I came in with the particular look of an elder who has known you long enough to see through what you are currently attempting to project, which in my case was composed and kingly, and she said, "Sit down, Calder. You look exactly like you did the year your father died, when you were trying to convince everyone you weren't frightened." I sat down. "I understand you finally did the obvious thing," she said. "I did it 4 years later than I should have." "Yes," she was quiet for a moment. "She didn't break, you know, while you were gone. I want you to understand that because sometimes people think that someone leaving for a kindness means the other person needed saving, and she didn't. She went on. She did good work. She was all right." "I know," I said. "Do you?" She looked at me steadily. "Because the story you need to not tell yourself is the one where you coming back to her is a rescue. She was not waiting for rescue. She was living her life in the way she always has, fully and usefully and without bitterness, and you are very lucky that the bond held, and that she is the kind of person who is willing to let something be rebuilt honestly instead of just walking away from the rubble." I was quiet for a moment. "She is the most remarkable person I have ever met," I said. "I knew this 3 years ago. I think I was afraid of being insufficient." Maren made a sound that was either agreement or mild exasperation, or possibly both. "You are going to spend the rest of your life being somewhat insufficient, Calder. That is the condition of loving someone excellent. The question is whether you can be honest about it." "I'm trying to be." "Good." She closed her eyes, and I thought she had finished, and then she said without opening them, "She made me the goat cheese again. It still isn't any good. Don't tell her I said that." Maren died on the 12th morning, just before the sun reached the window she had wanted open. Saren had been there through the night. I had ridden out at first light when the border runner reached me with the message that the elder had asked for quiet and company both, and I had arrived in time to sit with them both through the last hours. which were peaceful and unhurried and full of the particular quality of presence that Saren brought to difficult things, not managing them, not softening them, but simply being there, solid and warm, as if the difficulty was something that could be sat with until it passed. Marin's people came by mid-morning. There were arrangements to be made, the kind of arrangements that a beloved elder who has spent a lifetime in a particular place generates: territory, possessions, the disposition of the animals she had kept, the notification of the dozen-odd wanderers and strays she had taken in over the years who would need to know. Saren handled most of it with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. I helped where I was useful and stayed out of the way where I was not. In the late afternoon, when the cottage had been settled and the last of Marin's people had gone, Saren sat down on the low stone wall of the gate and was simply still for a while. I sat beside her. The borderland in the late afternoon was all river mist and the low gold light that comes before evening, and the elder's cottage behind us was quiet, and the wolves from the northern edge of the territory had come down, the way they sometimes do when something shifts in the land's feeling, and were sitting at a distance with the patient watchfulness of wolves who are not alarmed but are paying attention. After a while, Saren said, "She told me to let you try." I waited. 6 months after I left, she wrote me a letter. She said, "When he figures out what he did, let him try." I wrote back and told her I wasn't sure I wanted to. A pause. She wrote back and said that was fair, but to at least not decide in advance. She was right, I said. As usual. Yes, Saren looked at the wolves for a moment. I didn't come back here for you. I want you to know that. I came for her. I know. But I think, she stopped, started again. I think coming back and seeing that you are still the same person underneath all the king of it, I think that matters to me, more than I expected. The bond mark on my wrist was warm in the evening air, steady, quiet, the ember warmth of something that had weathered 3 years of suppression and was in no hurry now, having all the time it needed. I want to do this right, I said. I don't know exactly what that means yet. I know it means giving you time. I know it means being honest with you in the way I should have been honest 3 years ago, when I decided for you instead of asking you. I know it means being an Ethan Moore and you being, wherever you need to be, doing whatever work matters to you, and figuring out how those two things fit together in a way that doesn't ask you to stop being who you are. She was quiet for a moment. It's a cold kingdom, she said. Ethan Moore. It is. The river mist is very good for certain herbs. I've been thinking about that. I looked at her. She was looking at the wolves, and the corner of her mouth had moved in the way it moved when she was saying something, and meaning considerably more than the words carried. The borderland has good soil, I said carefully. The east wing of the hall has a southern aspect. I've been told the light there is good in the mornings. Has someone been told that? Bryn may have mentioned it, in passing, entirely speculatively. Saren turned to look at me, and her expression was the expression I had seen at the Eastern feast, the precursor to something, and this time it arrived. A small and genuine and entirely unguarded smile, the kind that comes not from happiness exactly but from the recognition of something that was always going to be true, eventually making itself finally visible. I'll stay through the end of the season, she said, and see. I named her my Luna before the court 3 weeks later. Not with ceremony, exactly. Saren would not have wanted the kind of ceremony that made a production of the naming, and Ethan Moore's traditions allowed for the simple form, the Alpha King's declaration before witnesses with the bond mark visible and the wolves in the hall acknowledging. Bryn had arranged it with the low-key precision she brought to things she considered overdue. Aldrich sent a letter of congratulations from Grenvin that was, I thought, rather more warmly worded than the circumstances strictly required, and which I appreciated. What I remember of that morning is not the declaration, or the witnesses, or even the formal weight of the bond mark confirmed publicly in the old language. What I remember is Saren standing beside me in the hall in the early winter light, with old Brennan's youngest wolf asleep on her foot, because he had discovered 3 weeks ago that she was not leaving and had made this his personal policy, and the way she looked, not surprised, not overcome, simply and completely present, as if this was where she had always been going and she had simply taken the scenic route. She stayed through the end of the season. She stayed through the winter. She found, as she had suspected, that the river mist was very good for the particular gray-leafed herb she had been trying to cultivate for 2 years, and that the east wing's morning light was adequate, and that Bryn knew the names of every tradesperson in the borderland territories who might be useful to a healer trying to establish a supply route. She found that Ethan Moore's wolves, once they had decided she was theirs, were committed to this position with the absolute certainty of pack animals who do not understand ambivalence. She found, I think, that I was trying. Not perfectly. I had spent a long time making decisions alone, and the habit did not disappear simply because I understood it was a habit. There were evenings when I did not say the thing I should have said, and she would look at me with the level, patient look that meant she was waiting and I should try again, and I would try again. There were mornings when the pull to manage rather than share was strong, and I caught it and chose differently. I was, as Marin had predicted, somewhat insufficient. I was honest about it, which she had told me once was not a small thing. My wolf did not go quiet again. He was settled, the settledness of a creature who has found his place and knows it, the deep rest of something that has stopped searching. On the nights Saren worked late in the east wing and I fell asleep before she came to bed, I would sometimes wake in the night to find her there, the wolf pup at her feet, the bond mark warm in the dark, and the strange feeling that the hall was full in a way it had not been full before, not louder, not busier, but inhabited in some deeper sense, as if every stone of the place had exhaled. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days of quiet, and then she came back through the gate in the river mist on her gray mare, and every single thing I had told myself fell away like something that had never been structural. I had made the wrong choice on a Tuesday. I spent the rest of my life making the right one,